Welcome everybody to the Learn Alpha podcast. I'm Van.
I'm Derek, and today we have with us a special guest, Mr. Paul LeBatard.
Hello.
Mr. Paul, we know you, and we know a lot of things about you, but the people out there don't. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, how you came up?
Well, I was born in Pascagoula, but raised in Goche all my life. You had to go to Pascagoula to get born back then. So, but anyway, I lived in Goche till I got married, and married in 1974, and married a girl named Charlotte Ware, Toddy Ware. So you call her Charlotte, nobody knows who you're talking about. But anyway, she was an old Van Cleve girl, and her mama told her that, being from Van Cleve, you're kin to everybody up here, so you got to leave Van Cleve to find a husband. So that's how she found me in Goche, and we were married and lived in Pascagoula for just a short time, and had bought a house over there. And her father, John C. Ware, owned a lot of land that he and his father had accumulated in their pulpwood business. And so he was dividing the land up and gave us a parcel there that had an old, actually his old home that he grew up in. And so we put our house for sale in Pascagoula, and with the intention of moving up here because someone was renting the house up here. And because we figured it's going to take, several months. Well, it sold the first week.
Oh, my goodness.
So we were without a place to live, but anyway, we was able to rent an apartment in Ocean Springs, and we stayed there until the end of May, and whenever the folks moved out of the house in Van Cleve here. So we moved into that house and stayed there and started making plans for remodeling it. Hired an architect out of Biloxi to expand it and add on and all that. Well, we got some drawings we were real happy with, and went to giving them to builders and how much is this going to cost. And we found out quick that we can tear that down and build a new house for about a third less, which is what we did.
Right.
We moved the house to another piece of land and sold it, and then built the house where we're at now in 1979.
Goodness. So
we've been there ever since, and then of course I got my little workshop behind the house. I built it back in '04. And before then, I was just kind of working out of the garage there a little bit, out of the utility room. But so anyway.
So you had a career at Chevron?
Started out in 1974, January '74 at Chevron. Actually worked, before that I worked at the shipyard and worked in the alignment department and then into inspection. And while I was there, one of the old gentlemen that I worked with from the very first day that I saw him, he told me, "Young feller like you, you're wasting your time at this shipyard. You need to be out at Standard Oil." And
that's what it was called before.
It was Standard Oil back then, yeah.
Okay.
And I said, "Well, man, I like what I'm doing here. I'm a good group of guys, and I'm single, don't need a lot of money." But he kept riding me about that. Finally, I said, "Well, just to get you off my back, I'm going to put in an application." And I don't remember if I called the employment office or I called Chevron. Whichever one I called, they directed me to call the other agency. Right. And this was like in September or October somewhere. And whoever I talked to said, "Well, we've already hired our group for this year, but we'll keep you on file." So I said, "Okay." Well, I got him off my back. Well, sure enough, the next year rolled around June, and I got a letter said, "If you're still interested, then come by and fill out an application." So I did that. And then I got another letter that said, "If you're still interested, report to the refinery take a test." And so I did that and passed the test, had a couple of interviews there, and got another letter a few weeks later says, "If you're still interested, come out to the refinery on January 7th. And so I did. And
3 letters of interest later, and you're working at Standard Oil.
That's it. Anyway, started out in blending and shipping in the tank field there, and worked for about 10 years, and then got an opportunity to go to one of the units, the boiler plant and the crude unit, and then various projects throughout the refinery, and was able to get on the Air Max project when they built the Air Max unit, and from the ground up. So I really enjoyed that portion of it. Got to travel a little bit and worked there, and then left there and went back to the crude unit, and then back to the tank field where I started, and so ended up my career about the last 15 years there. So, but anyway, all told, it was about 32 years and 6 months or so that I worked there.
So when you got there, so you said you were happy at Ingalls before. When you got there at Chevron or Standard Oil, was there ever a point in which you were working and you were like, hey man, I've arrived and this is the job that I want for the rest of my life?
Well, whenever I first went out there, the first day we went in, well, when I worked at Ingalls, there was, I think, 22,000 people there. So you was less than a number, really. When I went out there, I think there was like 23 or 24 people in my group. We went in and there was a table set up with your name plaque there and a notebook and some candy and a bottle of water and
you were like,
all of that. And
oh,
I
this
thought,
is it.
Man, I just can't believe this, you know. And they spent the first week with us. Just different superintendents would come in and speak to us about different, you know, aspects of the refinery. You know, what is a refinery? What do we do? And watched several videos, films. You know, how they are building the refinery and laying pipelines and all that. And it was very interesting. And the guys that I worked with, that I hired in with, most of those stayed, you know, the whole time that we were there. We all kind of followed each other and on different crews. You know, we worked rotating shifts. So, but made a lot of lifelong friends. And working with a group of men, especially on shift work, they're almost as much of a family as your family is, because you spend a lot of time with those people. And they are just I was so fortunate that the crew that I was assigned to was a group of good men, good Christian men. They went to church. They didn't party hardy and all of that. Some of the other crews, you know, a crew had a personality.
Right.
And I was just so fortunate to be on a crew with a bunch of great role models. And
you wasn't stuck on the Bad News Bears right away.
That's right. That's right.
You weren't on D shift.
Well, actually, it was D crew that I was on. It was A, B, C, D, and it was D crew that I was on.
Wow.
All right.
But it was just a good bunch of men that set good examples for me and molded my career and you know, helped me to get where I'm at today, I guess. So.
And so they also kind of helped you with just life in general too. I mean, through conversation.
They did. You know, back I was single when I hired on there, and got married. Well, hired in January and got married in November of that same year, and got all kind of good advice. You know how you know, every one of them said, you know, you need to center your life around church.
Yep.
You need to be a church family. And I was raised in the Episcopal Church in Goche. And we moved to Van Cleve, and we had to make a decision. Do we want to, because I didn't want to go to one church and my wife the other. And I was not real happy with the direction that the Episcopal Church was going. It was getting a little bit more liberal, and I was not real happy with some of the things. So the Methodist Church that she belonged to was kind of similar to the Episcopal Church in a lot of doctrine and all, and it wasn't quite as much ceremony, I guess you would say. But anyway, I joined the Methodist Church, the Mount Pleasant Methodist Church in Van Cleve here, and then been a member ever since, and all of our, you know, raised our family up there. So,
yeah, that's very important. We talked about that last week with Byron, and when you put that first in your life, it seems like everything else kind of falls into place. That's right.
It sure does. Now, they gave me some advice, you know. This is what you do when you get married. You know, if you want to go fishing and your wife don't want you to go fishing, follow her around step for step. If she stirs a pot on the stove, you stir it and taste it. She adds salt, you taste it, add some more. Says she'll send you fishing.
Yeah.
You know, after a while there. So
that's valuable information.
Yeah.
I don't know if I did that on purpose or not, but my wife and I don't exist in the kitchen at the same time. If I'm cooking, she don't come in there, and if she's cooking, I don't go in there.
Well, my wife is a very good cook. I'm fortunate about that, and I learned to cook at the refinery. You know, each control room had a kitchen. And we'd kind of take turns. Of course, usually there's one guy on the crew that we had a guy, Darrell Neese was his name, was a fireman in Mobile Fire Department prior to Chevron.
A fireman that knows how to cook. What a shocker.
Wow.
Yeah. They would actually sometimes, if you had a big project going on, you'd need overtime to stay over. And they would a lot of times ask him to stay over just to cook for the next crew there. So.
That's awesome. So besides that, you do other things. What do you do?
Well, I guess I'm most known for making knives. So actually, I made my first knife right after I hired on at the refinery in 1974. My grandfather on my mother's side was a blacksmith and made knives. I've got a number of his knives at the house right now. But they were mostly made out of old crosscut saws. Nothing fancy at all, just good what you would think of seeing in the kitchen there, working knives there. I never was able to actually work with him. He lived in Texas most of the time when I was growing up, so I only saw him occasionally. But I've always loved knives. My grandfather on my daddy's side lived next door to us. Well, he was a carpenter by trade and had a kind of a woodworking shop there, and I was in there playing all the time, and the very first knife that I made when I was just, I think, maybe 10 or 12 years old was picked up a piece of steel laying on the ground in his shop and had an old wash machine motor turning a grinding rock, and I ground on it and had the old garden hoe propped up against the wall, and I eased over there and cut off about 6 inches of the handle, and that ended up the handle for the knife, and more of a throwing knife. Somebody looked at it and said it looks like something that they would confiscate in a shakedown at the prison there, But anyway, I've still got that knife. I had lost it as a child, throwing it and whatever. And if I remember right, it was Hurricane Elena that the old shed behind my grandfather's house, a tree fell on. So we were cleaning it all up in a pile of lumber and rubble. And lo and behold, we found that knife under all that stuff. It'd probably been in the old shed there.
Wow. So
I've still got that. So whenever I go to
That's awesome.
A knife show or whatever, I always bring that and put that on the table. This is my first knife, very first knife.
That's cool. Not a lot of people can do that.
Yeah. And then when I hired in the refinery, kind of, like I said, I've always liked knives and guns, and I used to do a little wood carving, little dogs and things like that, but had an interest in pocket knives and hunting knives and all. And I saw an article in a magazine, and if I remember right, they were advertising some type of a wet rock or sharpening system. And to test it out, they had a knife that someone had made from a saw blade. And it still had the saw teeth on the back of the blade. They'd left it on there to use like a bone saw. So I was at the refinery when you first hired on, I was in operations, but they would put you in on a maintenance crew to teach you, how things worked and all that. Well, one of the men I was working with had a handful of saw blades he'd got for the job there, and I told him, I said, well, look, if you break one of those blades, let me have it. I'm going to try to make a knife out of it. He says, all right. Bam! He hit him on a pipe, broke all of them. So here, you can have all these. So anyway, I got to the house and took it, and I thought, well, I kind of wanted to make a fillet knife. So the blades were kind of long and thin and fairly flexible. So I ground and ground and ground and finally had something that looked like a fillet knife. And left the saw teeth on the back. I said, well, that'll be a good fish scaler. And I used to, when I did wood carving, I carved cedar. I always liked cedar, the way it smelled and pretty color. So naturally, I said, well, I'll just use cedar for the handle. And so that's what I did. I had it put on with some pins and stuff and all. And somebody saw it and they said, "Man, that's pretty good. How much you want for that?" Well, I didn't really make it to sell, but at that time, a Rapala fillet knife, which was probably the most popular, was about $8.
Yeah, I remember them. Yeah,
Yeah.
So I said, "Well,
everybody's had a couple of those."
yeah." I said, "Well, how about $8?" So yeah, that's good. So okay, so picked up another blade and I made another knife there, and somebody wanted it. So next thing I know, I'm a part-time knife maker, and I made one of those knives and give it to my grandfather, who where I started everything there. And anyway, when he passed away, I was able to get that knife back, and I have that knife now. So
wow,
man, what a piece of history to have.
Yeah, so it's and then I made a number of knives out of the saw blades like that. And the bad thing about those was the saw blades were awful hard. Now it held an edge real well, but it would not stand any abuse. And several of the guys would bring the knives back to me with the points broke off, and a couple of them broke off right at the handle. Well, I mean, they'd been prying or something they probably shouldn't have done, but I realized that if I'm going to do this, I need to use some type of steel that's the regular knife steel. So at that time, there was only one knife supply business in the country, and it was Bob Scrimsher's Knife Making Supply out of somewhere in Texas. And so I found a phone number for him and called him up and bought a piece of 440C stainless steel and ground a knife from it there and sent it back to him, and he heat treated it, sent it back to me, and put a guy had a set of elk antlers, and he told me, he said, "I'll tell you what," said, "I'll trade you this set of elk antlers if you'll make me a knife." So I did. I traded him the antlers for the knife there, and it was big enough to where enough points where I think I made about maybe 10 or 12 knives out of that. But I would, same supplier for years and years, I would buy the steel from him and send it to him. And then found out that other knife makers' supplies were coming up in the business. And there was one out of Florida there, Sheffield Knife Maker Supply, that probably was the biggest one in the country at at that time. So I got to know them real well, and would call and order steel and ask them how to do things and supplies and what to do, and they helped me a lot. But probably my biggest influence, I met a man at one of the gun shows in Biloxi, David Messer. And he and his brother, Freddie Messer, Freddie lived in Goche, and David lived in Summerall, Mississippi. Well, he was the only custom knife maker I had ever met in my life. And most of his knives were hunting knives and all, and Bowie knives. He liked to make Bowie knives. But I had one of the old knives I made out of the 440C that I ground on the old washing machine motor, and it was pretty rough, but it didn't look half bad. But I brought it with me to the gun show in Biloxi, and I met them and introduced myself, and they said, "Well, let's see one of your knives," and I had it. So they come on, sit down here by us, and spent several hours. And I said, "Well, I've been thinking about buying a grinder and don't know what kind." They said, "Well, you need to get a Bader grinder. That's the best kind, and that's what I use and all that." So was able to order a Bader grinder from Sheffield Supply, and that's what really changed my life there. It was 1981 then. My youngest son had just been born. We got a pretty good income tax refund. And my wife told me, she said, "Well, you've been wanting one of them fancy grinders, and now's the time. We got a little money here." So at that time, I think it was about $800. And so I ordered the grinder, and that grinder changed my knife-making career for the 100%. I tell people I went from making homemade knives to handmade knives.
Right.
Because that grinder, using the belt like that, I was able to grind the steel from the rough grind all the way through the finer grits up to almost a mirror polish, and could grind and shape handles and sharpen the blades and everything on it. So that really made a difference. And since then I have upgraded. I think I've got 3 grinders in my shop now, plus my old original grinder outside on the welding table, still running. So
wow.
Yeah.
So when you got hooked, and I'm just trying to keep up here because you got a really great story. So you're at the shipyard. Some guy badgers you into applying at Standard Oil. You get to Standard Oil and you're like, this is a great job.
Yep.
And while you're there, you accidentally come across the circumstances that put you into making knives.
That's exactly right.
That's what you identify as a knife maker, not as much as, you know, this professional or that professional. That's where you really started to shine.
Right, right. Well, at the ship or at the refinery, I was an operator. You know, what do you do? Well, I turn valves.
Right.
I climb tanks and catch samples. That's if not really skilled. It wasn't like I was a machinist or an electrician where you had a skill. So I kind of developed my own skills there, you know. So
what about coming up as a teenager or anything like that? Your educational background, was there anything that with machinery that educated you back, or excuse me, that interested you back then, or were you always interested in working with your hands like that?
I always liked working with my hands. Like I say, I used to whittle, carve little dogs and things like that. My grandfather next door had a woodworking shop, and I would tinker around with little stuff like, you know, nothing elaborate, didn't build boats or anything like that, or furniture, but just always liked guns, you know, hunting and fishing, and knives to use for the hunting and fishing and all.
God bless America.
Ain't that the truth? And but anyway, growing up, you know, I lived to hunt. You know, deer hunting this season, that was, and fishing. Grandpa had an old a skiff that he built, old cypress skiff that he kept in Bayou Pierre down in Gautier, and I'd ride the bicycle down there and get in, had oars, you know, and I'd row out there and do a little fishing, a little hunting, and duck hunting and different things. Just, you know, grew up on the water and in the woods, and never really did much running around or anything like that, you know. And living in Gautier, I didn't have the advantage. We had to drive or ride a school bus to high school. So I was not able to play sports or anything because I didn't have no way to get back and forth. And never really had a big interest in sports anyway. I was more of an outdoors hunting and fishing type. So
you can't eat playing basketball, but you can from fishing.
That's right. That's right. Teach a man to fish, you know, and feed him for life there. So
you get your grinder, and I'm saying this because I've kind of been through it. You know, I started off, you know, making knives here and there, and you know, I got a little Harbor Freight grinder, and then when I finally had saved up enough and got my big one, I made the mistake and told my friends that I like to make knives. So then I found out real quick that there was a lot more orders than I had time in the day to make things for. Did you? And you obviously make better knives than I do. So well, did you run into that as well? Did you find a point very early on that you thought you were swamped, or?
Well, it could get that way. You know, from the get-go, I never did this to make a living. I mean, you get a little money trickle in, and I would use the money to upgrade equipment more than anything else. But as I got more equipment and better equipment makes better knives, you know. It speeded up production. Orders kept coming in, so, you know, the money would come in, and most of the money would go for Christmas vacations and things like that, you know,
help out.
You know. Right. It wasn't something that I depended on. It was just a little bit extra there, but most of it went back into the shop there. And like I say, I worked for a long time out of our carport, had a little 12 by 12, which was a utility room off of it when we built the house, and but I made that my knife making shop. And it was very handy because, you know, I'd come home from work and you just, you know, go out and through the door and there you are in the shop. But then I realized that I needed something bigger. So in 2004, I drew up plans and all, and went ahead and built the shop. I started out 21 by 30, poured the slab that size behind this house, and plumbed it up so I got a bathroom in there and a little kitchenette. So everything but a bed. I don't want to put a bed out there because Miss Toddy might
come up with an idea for you. Huh?
Right. So, but that's kind of my man cave. You know, I go out there. I've got 3 grinders set up now, and I don't know what, 4 drill presses, a milling machine, surface grinders, 2 heat treat ovens, and I'd hate to have to buy all that equipment at one time today. I couldn't begin to tell you the value of all of it, but just a piece at a time, and some of it I was able to swap equipment for and swap knives for and all. So
you took a hobby like most men, and I'm just going to say this: most men, their hobby costs their family money.
Right.
And so you took your hobby, which was a healthy hobby. You were at home. You wasn't out running roads or anything like that. And you took that and made it a blessing to the family instead of taking away from it.
That's right. And I tell folks it keeps me out of the beer joints and from chasing bad women and all that. You know, so. But it's just a lot of fun. It's something that I've got a routine. You know, I get up in the morning. I usually get up first. I put the coffee on. Miss Toddy says, well, wake me up when coffee's ready. And we drink our coffee, read our Bible, have our breakfast, and drink our coffee till usually about 9:30. And I'll leave out to the shop, and she'll do her thing. And usually about 4:30 in the evening, I start shutting the shop down, come on back inside, and we have our evening there, you know. So life is good.
Probably wouldn't be very good if y'all was right next to each other all day, every day.
That absence makes the heart grow fonder, they say, you know. So
I found that out myself.
But you know, you have something you really enjoy doing. It gives you something to get up for every morning. That's and right. Of course, my wife, she has her interests and all, her music and things she does, and so it's got our grandkids next door to us there, and that's always a lot of fun. So,
and have any of them come over and wanted to build knives with you, or you?
They really hadn't taken an interest in it. You know, I've got 2 sons, and neither one of them. They're both, you know, really different. My oldest boy, he's really into boats and hunting and that kind of thing, and fishing. My youngest boy is into tractors and farming and that kind of thing.
Right.
And neither one of them, though, has really expressed an interest in learning. I don't think they have the patience, because it does take a lot of patience to do this. So, but you know, sometimes they say it skips a generation.
Yeah.
My oldest grandson's in the Army now. In fact, he's home right now. He'll be going back to Texas there for his. He's going to be a medic, I think, to complete his training there. And but I made him one of my combat knives. I gave him whenever he graduated boot camp there in North Carolina there.
Man, what a treat!
Yeah. So, but he treasures that, you know. But you know, he hadn't shown any interest in wanting to learn to make knives now. Got another grandson that's just behind him, is 16 now, that not sure about him. He's more into the video games and that kind of thing. Now my youngest son has 2 twin boys that just turned 5.
Wow.
And I got a feeling that one of them may, or both of them, may take an interest in it there.
That's cool.
Yeah.
That's all that knowledge is something you don't want to not pass on to somebody, because you know you had those guys help you get started with the right grinder and things like that, but did you have somebody that was constantly around you to kind of help guide you?
I did not. All I could do was go, you know, talk to them on the phone. I found several knife makers across the country, none real local here. So I back then it was long distance phone calls, you know, and so I kind of limit what I did. I didn't want to run the bill up too much, but all I could, you know, I talked to them and learned what I could, and made a lot of mistakes. I mean, and early on I learned, you know, don't throw your mistakes away. And I have probably, I'm not going to say trained, but I worked with probably a dozen or more young men, helping them to learn the craft. And one of the things that I always tell them is when you make a mistake, don't throw it away. Set it aside, because as your skill increases, you may discover something that you can do with that to repair it, or in my case, I have actually come up with completely new designs. The knife is not what I had in mind to start with, But what I ended up with was a really great knife that's useful for something else than what I originally planned.
As Bob Ross would say, a happy little mistake.
Happy mistakes.
Well, I've got a big question for you when it comes to that.
All right.
So I know that you've taught people, you taught me a lot of lessons, and with that being said, you found this hobby that you absolutely loved, that helped you out with your family and gave you something to do and some purpose. Could you tell us how you found balance? Did you ever have any trouble finding balance between work and home and work and your knife making?
Well, whenever you're working, you don't. The knife making has to take second. Your job comes first, and working shift work was a challenge anyway because you're gone at night a lot of times. And your wife's there with young children and a lot going on, so. The time off, you want to spend as much time with them as you can. So having the shop right there at the, onto the house at the time was very convenient because, I could just step in and out and all. And back then I didn't make a lot of knives anyway. I might make 20 or 30 in a year. So where now I probably make over 100 a year. So
wow.
You just reached a magic milestone number with that, didn't you?
I did. About that. Back in, I guess it was around early 90s, maybe 91, 92. And I can't remember if someone suggested this to me or it just come to me that, I ought to start putting numbers on these knives, serial number. And I'll tell you what, I remember now, a friend of mine found some of my knives in a pawn shop and asked when I had made them. Well, I couldn't really remember. So he said, well, if you put numbers on them, you could. And I thought about that. I said, well, that's a good idea. So I bought a set of stencils where you stamp the numbers in the blade, and you have to do that before you heat treat it while it's still soft. So I started out with 000, and that's a buddy of mine, Robbie Goff, that I worked with at the refinery there. He's got number 0, or may still have it, 000. And then the next one was 001, and then I went all the way up. And in fact, the other day, I just stamped number 3000.
Wow!
So,
and your knives are beautiful. I'm friends with you on Facebook, and I watch some of the stuff that you put out there, and it is unbelievable the craftsmanship you have in those things.
Well, the old saying is the way you can tell a good knife maker from a bad knife maker is how well he hides the mistakes. So anything that's handmade is going to have flaws in it, so you just try to mitigate the situation there. Try to hide them best you can. But you want to make them pretty, I try to tell people that my philosophy is I want to make the knife look so good that somebody comes by and they want to pick it up, and then it feels so good in the hand they don't want to put it down. So.
And speaking of that, you'll have an event this weekend, right?
We do. Back for a number of years, we would hold this little event. It started off with just a bunch of knife makers, of guys that I had worked with and trained, and friends would invite them to our shop. And then it got a little bit bigger and bigger, and we started inviting our clients and customers. And then it branched out not just to knife makers, but anything handmade. Didn't matter if you turned wood or you made swings or furniture or bird calls or whatever. And it got bigger and bigger. Then the Mississippi Songwriters Association got involved with us, and they would come set up and play music. And several of the guys would cook, do jambalaya or barbecue. And Derek would set up there and do his pulled pork and stuff for us there. But it got bigger and bigger, and it got to the point where we had a sign-in sheet, and not everybody would sign in, but as you'd sign in, you'd have a number by your name, and we had door prizes, and I'd always make a knife from start to finish that day, and everybody was elbow to elbow in the shop watching me make the knife, and then we'd give the knife away at the end of the day there. That was the grand prize drawing. But it got so big that there was over 500 people signed in the last year that we had it at my shop. So we had to move it to the arena, the Conrad Mallett Multipurpose Arena there in Van Cleve, which was really ideal because it's covered.
Yeah, you're in the shade. Don't have to worry about the rain.
Don't have to worry rain. And you know, we were very fortunate. All the years we did it at my shop, we only had one year where it rained, and that didn't start till like maybe 2:30 that afternoon. So it was pretty well winding down by that time anyway. But once we moved it to the arena, that solved that problem. The only disadvantage of it is we've kind of lost the picnic type atmosphere that we had. Because around my shop was all wooded and you know, shady, and people would have their tents set up all around and the music going, and it was just a lot of fun. And there was always that little doubt in the back of my mind, though, if somebody gets hurt, you know, they may be wanting to sue me and that kind of thing. So once we moved it to the arena, first thing they told us is you're going to have an insurance policy, which we did, and in case anyone does get hurt or injured, you know, we're covered for that now. But this will be the third year that we've had it at the arena, and it's going to be this Saturday. We'll start about 8 o'clock in the morning, and we'll start with an opening prayer and pledge allegiance to the flag, and we'll have Sue Stringer's little girl's going to sing the national anthem for us. So
awesome!
It's and then we'll go from there. We'll have I'm not sure how many vendors we'll actually have there, because we never know until the last minute. You know, they keep showing up and set up, because we got plenty of room in there for them to set up, and we got 2 food vendors that's going to be there serving all kind of food and stuff that day, snowballs and cold drinks and hot dogs and food that you can walk around and eat while you're, you know, enjoying the festivities there. So
that's great. One day, one of the last times you had it at your house, we came around the corner. My wife says, "What is going on there? There's so many cars there. Is there a wedding?" I was like, "No, that's not."
Jambalaya, pulled pork and knives.
Yeah,
that's right.
That's a whole bunch of America going on there.
That's right. Derek would bring his the old Sarge there, the old barbecue there, and set it up that Friday evening and smoke the briskets or the pulled pork shoulders there all night long, and put a little bit of Sweet Baby Ray's there mixed with it there. So
that's one of the reasons your wife married you, because you can cook. I mean,
she taught me everything I know.
Yeah.
One of the things that I noticed right away, because I ended up meeting Mr. Paul at one of these hammer-ins. I had started making knives on my own, and I'm still in the homemade phase, not quite into the handmade phase yet. But you know, I went there and I was surprised at how much of a family environment there was. Like, you know, people were bringing their sons and daughters, and, you know, there wasn't any drinking going on. There wasn't a whole bunch of nasty talk going on. It was just a real family type environment. And, you know, a lot of the, you know, some other, and I consider knife making and blacksmithing an art.
It absolutely is.
And a lot, you know, some other artists in other lines of work are kind of snobbish, to be honest. And I found out right away in the blacksmithing community, particularly with Mr. Paul, they want to share that knowledge, and they want to continue those things forward through the generations. So all I had to do was ask, and then I would be inundated with information. So I had to learn how to shut up and listen. You know,
that is one of the unique things about this craft. There is very few secrets. I've only met, I think, one man that thought he might have something that nobody else had, and he just did not want to share that. But everybody else has just gone out of their way to, they'll sit down and make you a list of where you buy your materials from or what works for them, and you know, this is how I do this. This is the kind of grinder I use. This is a steel, and this is why I use that. And you can go to this place and find the prettiest handle wood and all that. Just everybody has been more than willing to share this. And, you know, I've had a number of people that I have taught, or I say taught, that I have helped get started.
You taught them.
And they'll ask me, you know, well, how much will you charge me to teach me to make a knife? And I always tell them, you know, the only thing that I ask is that you pass this craft on to somebody else.
Wow.
Because it's too important a thing to let die. We need to, handmade things now is more popular than they have probably ever been
in
a long time. You know, at one time everything was handmade. When Grandpa built his house, made all of his molding, made everything. I mean, that's just the way it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then as machine technology got better and better, we started relying more on machine-made things. And then the Japanese, with they took off, and now the Chinese and all. And people, I think, have grown tired of that mass-produced, everything cookie cutter, the same. Want something different. I want something unique.
Yeah, there's no authenticity to it.
That's right. And everything handmade, even though I've got standard patterns that I make, no two knives are just alike. Even though I start out with the same pattern, same type of steel thickness, same type of wood or bone or whatever, the knives are going to end up feeling different in the hand, looking a little bit different, but that's the unique thing about it. You kind of pour your soul into every piece that you make there.
Yeah.
Each piece had its own personality. So.
Well, to me, that's the draw to it, and to put things into perspective for those out there, 3,000 knives isn't a lot of knives for a company who runs them down an assembly line and cuts them out with laser machines and all that other kind of stuff. For a man, and I've seen Mr. Paul do it, and it's hard to describe in words. You can look all this stuff up on YouTube, on how people make these things. For a man to start with just nothing in bare materials to a finished knife, and everything was done with his two hands, that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of knowledge, and it takes a lot of effort. So 3,000 knives is a big deal.
Yeah.
It's a real big deal.
It's a milestone.
And you have something else that goes along with that too regarding the way you hand make knives. Tell us about your 100%ers.
Well, one of the things that I've always aspired to was, you want to be with like-minded people, other knife makers. Well, back in the early 70s, there was a organization formed called the Knife Makers Guild. A man named A.G. Russell. You've probably seen A.G. Russell catalogs and all that. Well, he bought a block of tables at the Tulsa Gun Show in '73 and invited Bob Lovelace and I don't know, maybe a dozen or so knife makers. There wasn't that many back then, but the ones that he knew about. And gave them these tables. And then after the show was over, they kind of had a meeting, and they formed the Knife Makers Guild and agreed to meet every year, do that. Well, it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and it got to be the biggest knife organization in the country. And so when I found out about that, I have always aspired. I want to be a member of the Knife Makers Guild. And what you had to do was apply for membership. And then you had to present 4 of your knives to 4 different voting members, and they would critique them and tell you, this is good, this is bad, you need to do this. But it had to pass inspection, and then you were granted a probationary membership. And then for the 2 years later, you would go back and present 4 more knives, and if they were good enough then, you were voted in as a member of the Knife Makers Guild. Well, in 1989, the Knife Makers Guild show was in Orlando, Florida. And we were on vacation down there, and I said, well, while we're at Disney World, the show was being held at one of the hotels just outside of Disney World.
No coincidence in that timing.
No, just blind luck. So,
honey, we're taking the kids to Disney.
Yeah. So anyway, I took 4 of my knives with me down there, and while they were at Disney, I grabbed a bus and went to the show there, and went to the first guy there, and I introduced myself and showed him the knives and had the sheet he filled out. Yep, this one's good, and that. So I went to 4 different makers there and got the signatures. Well, the requirement at the time was once you got approved, you had to attend the next show, which would be a year later, and it was going to be in Orlando again.
Surprise, honey, we're going to Disney again.
Well, the bad thing about it, see, I was working at the refinery at the time, and by then it had become Chevron. It was not Standard Oil anymore. But when you work in operations, you have a rotation for vacation.
Yeah.
You're number 1, you get to pick. You're number 2, you get. Well, I was not able to get a vacation and get off for the show. So whenever it come time for the show, I had to let my membership application lapse because I couldn't go. So I said, well, heck, I just kept making my knives and trying to improve my game there. Well, in 2006, I retired from Chevron, and first thing I did was went down to the show, got my approval, and joined the guild. And then 2 years later, went back and got my voting status then. Well, at that time, the Knife Makers Guild had very strict guidelines, how you had to conduct, not necessarily, not just how you make your knives, but how you conduct your business, you know. And one of the advantages of being in the guild is if a customer was not happy with your work, like you took a deposit and then didn't deliver the knife or whatever, they could go to the guild and they would make it right. Either the guild would give them his money back or assign another member to make a knife for him. So that whenever you become a member of the Knife Makers Guild, that was like a good housekeeping seal of approval.
Wow.
You've got to be good enough to be in this organization, and when you are, you're guaranteed that you know we're going to take care of your customers and all.
That's cool that it was ethical too.
Very ethical. That's one of the most important things about it there. And then they had seminars, and if you had difficulty with an aspect of knife making, they would assign you a mentor to help you through that particular barrier there. Well, as technology increased or advanced, knife equipment advanced, and it got to the point where you could have your blades laser cut out or you know, CNC machined and all that. So big controversy in the guild. You know, what is a handmade knife? You know, if you're not holding that knife the whole time, is it still handmade?
Right.
So they finally decided that if you own the equipment, you have a CNC machine, and you put that blank of steel in that machine, and you program that thing, and you push that button, and it makes a knife. As far as they were concerned, it was a handmade knife. A lot of us in there did not agree with that. We still like the old way, where you actually hold that knife, you control all the aspects of it. So a splinter group was formed called the 100%ers, because we do 100% of the work. And there was a little bit of hard feelings between some of the members.
Surely they had to understand, though.
They did, and you know, it was all smoothed over and all that. But what they finally decided was, you know, if you want to make your knives that way with the machine, you know, more power to you. If you want to do it handmade, that's you know. But and I think the only requirement that the guild has now is that you sharpen it by hand. I mean, that's the. Wow. But I'm on the technical committee now. If someone wants to join the guild, I'm on that panel that they bring the knife in, or their 4 knives, and set them, and they leave the room, and we look through them and critique them. Then we call them back in and tell them what's what. And I asked a guy come in, and he had some folding knives, and they were immaculate. I mean, it blew me away. I've never seen that degree of workmanship. And one of the first questions I always ask them is, you know, what kind of grinder do you use? I don't have a grinder. I said, what? Yeah, it's CNC. You know, I use CNC machine, but he sharpened it on a wet rock. You know, so. But it was immaculate. It was flawless, completely flawless. I couldn't find any mistakes at all, but it was more or less made with a machine.
Right.
So that's what inspired me to be a member of the 100%ers. And there for a while, we had our own little show, a micro show, I guess you'd call it, because it was only like 20 to 22 members, knife makers were there. And we held it at a knife shop in Texas. It was a knife shop in a mall there in Plano, Texas, and right out in the front of the thing. So I always did real well. I sold just about everything I brought, but I think we had 4 shows. And then the mall started having problems, and one thing led to the other, and we've kind of, I'm not going to say we've gone away, but we're just not as connected as we were. the movement has kind of lost steam. So we may try to do something to rejuvenate that, because the importance of making things by hand, I think, is more important right now than it has been in the past.
Oh yeah, because what's going to happen in the future if cell phones ever get corrupted or we lose power? A large portion of our population will be standing in line somewhere to receive a service they're never going to get.
That's right. And you know, talking about making knives, one thing that we hadn't really touched on, there's two basic ways to make a knife. The old way was to forge. You took a piece of steel, heated it up in a forge, and put it on an anvil and a hammer, and you beat it to shape. And the primary reason that knives were made that way was that was the only way you could make it. They didn't have these high tech grinders that we use now. Also, steel back in the old days was a very valuable commodity. So you had to take a small piece of steel and make as big a blade as you could out of it. So by heating it and hammering it, you could stretch that steel into a larger piece there. And there's some controversy about, does that make a superior knife? Is that knife better quality if it's hammered than if it's ground out? There again, that's something that they argue about. One of the things that I subscribe to is whenever you do beat a knife out like that, you're putting a lot of stresses in those steels, in that steel there. And before you can do anything with it, you have to relieve all those stresses through a process what they call normalization. You heat it up and let it cool real slow. And what that does, it takes all the stresses that was put in it from the hammer, it relieves all of that, normalizes it, which means it changes it back into the state it was prior to ever being struck by a hammer. So if you did put some magical properties in it with that hammer, you took them back out when you normalized it there.
Right.
So now I don't claim to know everything there is to know about steel. Somebody might can prove me otherwise on that. But the quality of the steel that we have now is so superior to what was available even 20 years ago that you can make such a superior blade by just grinding it, you know, to shape like I do on 99% of the knives I make. The cutting competitions that they have now, where they see how many ropes they can chop through and 2x4s, and each step of the way they have to check the edge, and it can't be any chipping or anything. It's got to be razor sharp. All of those knives are stock removal knives. Everyone that wins now,
wow,
is stock removal. They use it, most of them out of M4, which is a high-speed tool steel.
Super steel that wasn't available to the common.
It's only been available for the last 15 years or so.
Wow.
But that's not to say that a forged knife is not a good knife. It is. It can be a superior knife. But there's many opportunities to put a flaw in that knife when you're hitting it with a hammer. If you get it too hot, or if you strike it when it's not hot enough, you can put hidden flaws in that blade.
Right.
And sometimes if everything lines up right, the stars are in line, the temperature is just right, and you're in a good mood, you'll make a blade that probably will be as good as you can possibly hope for. But if you do anything wrong, you can end up with a flaw that might
cause you to start all over again.
That's right. And then now stock removal, same thing. You can get it too hot if you're grinding it, or you can get it too thin. If you do your own heat treating, which I do, you got to be very careful with that. If you get it too hot, or you quench it in the wrong medium, use the wrong type of oil or whatever, you can put flaws in that blade. The only way to try to mitigate that is trial and error, find out what works, write it down, develop muscle memory so that you can repeat these steps same way over and over. The Japanese samurai sword is a classic example. They didn't really write down how they did that, but it was apprentice, would serve from the time he was 10 years old all the way up till he was, 30 or so, he'd become a master. But there was a ceremony they went through. I mean, they would say their prayer to the altar and face us this way and stand on this left foot, and everything was done exactly the same over and over and over and over. So that's the way they were able to get repeatable successes there. So I think Bob Loveless is the one that talked about that we didn't like accidental successes. We tried to eliminate every variable that there is that you can possibly do it so that you can repeat your successes there. Because if you have accidentally make a really good knife, you're not really sure how you did it.
Right.
You may not be able to make another one just like that. So,
well, with all those life experiences, both making knives by hand and also at work and going to church, we have a lot of different guys that watch our podcast, different ages. What would be the best advice you give to a young guy who maybe just became a father and he's working a job and he's on those shutdowns? What advice would you give to a young man?
Well, family first. You know, whenever Toddy and I getting ready to get married, we talked to an old preacher. And he told us, he said, you know, you've heard that marriage is 50-50. And we said, yeah. He said, well, it's not. He said, marriage is 90-10. You give 90% and only expect 10%, and you'll be all right. Because there are times that you cannot give, you can't even hardly give the 10%.
Right. So
give what, you know, you give that 90%, only expect 10, and only expect 10, you may get that 90%. That's a good philosophy, and I've never forgot that. And I wish I could say I always did that. I did my best to, but you know, there's times whenever you're just not going to be able to give that not even, like I say, not even 10%. But being honest and truthful, if you say you're going to do something, do it. Don't your word has got to be your bond. Find you a church, go to church, worship together. You know, I told a story in our Sunday school thing one time, you know, it kind of related knife making to this, that you take carbon by itself and iron by itself is not, you know, neither one of them is a useful thing, just like a man and a woman. But if you combine that iron and that carbon together, you make steel, where if a man and a woman is married, they become one, they're stronger than they are individually. And then when you go to church and get God into your life, that becomes the fire, the forge. It forges into your marriage, and that makes it strong.
Well, I just want to say from everybody that I know that's in our blacksmithing community, thank you for all that you've done. You've made, if you never wondered if you made a difference in anybody's life, you made a difference in mine. You know, I never had the opportunity to be taught. I had to learn a lot of the lessons on my own. My father died whenever he was, you know, whenever I was very young. So I just didn't have a whole lot of people to teach me those lessons. And just to have somebody welcome me in the shop like you did and provide a good example, sir, I just want to say thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. You know, and by putting numbers and my name on those knives, 100 years from now, I'll be dead and gone, but that knife that I made with my name on it and that number is still out there, and somebody's using it and valuing it and you know, maybe even trading it, selling it, and making money off of it. So, but it's kind of like buying immortality.
Yep. Well, we'd like to thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. We appreciate your time.
I have thoroughly enjoyed it.
And just know that a lot of these young guys will get a lot out of this, and I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.
You guys please like and subscribe. We'll see you next week. Thank you.